Turn off your lights. Make sure your doors and windows are locked. Things are about to get spooky. My Appalachian Inspo-Trip has gone horribly wrong. By Agitated Fishing 4700. Balancing a bag on my shoulder, I let the screen door shut behind me. It responds with a thud with the carelessness a town like Eastwood deserved. It was a small Chicago neighborhood, but if it weren't for the Back to Blue sign posted in every front lawn, you'd never guessed. It was a picturesque piece of suburbia with taxes that could only be justified by city limits. A classic from the shelf of the Midwest experience. Kids loitering in parking lots and getting drunk after robbing Jewel Esco. The streets were quiet at night, except for the reverberating cackle of a gaggle of teens and the distant horn of a cargo train making its way across the seams of the city. When I was a kid, I would imagine that I could hear the distant howl of a werewolf under the full moon, shedding its school uniform and revealing its own rambunctiousness. The suffocating conformity of white picket borders and human skin was why I needed to go, why I spent the entirety of my life crawling at the door, ready to leave. It was an ever-present personification of ambition traded for certainty. I, on the other hand, was frothing at the mouth with antipophobia and visions of artistic splendor. I want to write. I craved creation. I dreamt of building a world so lucid you think the pages were made of glass. I had found it near impossible to spark life into literature when I hadn't had a single original experience my entire life. I felt out of place in my own home, a psychological suburb in between city and cattle pasture. I dreaded falling into mundane uniformity, subjecting myself to years of endless teasing and the occasional hurling of homophobic slur. I was a perpetual eyesore in the crisply manicured scenery. My solution? A road trip to the northeast United States in a disheveled minivan I found abandoned at my uncle's scrapyard. 19 and not ready to commit to a college, I packed up the bare essentials and loaded a whole load of mediocrity into a van. I had exactly half an idea of what I was going to do. The plan, or lack thereof, was to stay out there for a year, rotating between sleeping on a thin mattress in the back of the car and leasing whatever shacks I could find in the Appalachian. Looking back at it, it was naive in me to have thought so assuredly that this whimsical road trip would give me the material I needed to become a best-selling author, or at least one that wasn't appreciated in my time in 45 years. In response to my father's worries that I'd be in danger traversing both the interstate and the wilderness alone, I recruited my favorite Fleabag to come with me. He was a fellow college-age kid with a lust for adventure and a disdain for company. He also wasn't particularly excited to go back to school after having just escaped AP Calculus, a perfect candidate. I tossed my bag into the back seat of the Honda and made my way to Warren's place to pick him up in the city proper. I looked in disdain at the scenery as I navigated toward Dan Ryan Expressway. If you're not into the aesthetic vintage neighborhoods or along the glittering river, Chicago really is a shithole. I finally made it to his mom's place and laid on the horn. Might as well. I saw a brief flash of a middle finger through the window and felt the jostling of the car as two heavy bags were offloaded into the trunk. Once we were both comfortably seated, we turned onto the interstate and sailed in for the 20-hour trip.
Morning, sunshine.
I offered, but he gave me a shell glare in return.
All year to go backpacking, and you wake me up at 6 a.m.
I only offered a shake of the head in return. My mind wandered as we left the concrete jungle for an endless ocean of wheat and corn. The Midwest doesn't get enough credit for its scenery. People will tell you that it's all the same, flat and dull, but I find something calming about it. Rolling waves of blonde with little red cow sheds sprinkled about. Its endlessness gave me the same sort of optimism that staying on a beach does. It's no Atlantic, but it has its charms. When we passed into New England and the Pennsylvania landscape shifted towards jagged skylines, I stared in exhaustion, awe at the scenery surrounding me. I would have never been able to imagine this kind of beauty in 1,000 summers spent at home. I turned my gaze to the boy sleeping soundly to my right. I smiled a bit. I don't think many people would place us in the same category of crazy, but here we were, a pair that worked together as surprisingly as cheese and peanut butter. I threw an arm into his chest and startled him for what could have been a very restful sleep cramped between the dashboard and the headrest.
Find me a motel. Anything with a bed before I fall asleep at the wheel.
I ordered as he pulled his phone out from under him. Unfortunately, Warren never got his driver's license, so it had fallen upon myself to drive us halfway across the country while he got to doze off sporadically. I turned my attention back towards the windows. We were encompassed by thick trees on all sides looming over us like overprotective parents.
No beds around here. Not for another hour's away anyway.
He replied after a few minutes. The news was accompanied by a pitying glance.
So you want me to send us careening off a mountainside?
There's a campsite at the next exit. Pull off and we can roll out the bed in the back.
I let out a groan. The back of the van can only be so comfortable. I didn't have much of a choice though, so I peeled off the spindly main road and parked the car in one of those designated spots. The two of us feasted on cans of SpaghettiOs and root beer on the van's roof before being shooed back inside by the rumble of impending rain. Sitting atop a pile of blankets and pillows, we started to wind down. The drowsiness of the early summer and days' worth of driving had caught up to us. I braced myself to wake up in 5 short hours to continue driving, stretching out as much as possible.
Bo,
He whispered.
What?
good night.
That's it?
Good night.
Good night, Warren.
I replied, a bit confused by the whole interaction. That was the last thing I remember before waking up with a fright. I sat up and spun around, trying to figure out what had set me uneasy. It didn't help that the woods seemed to absorb all semblance of light. I listened to the piddling of the thick rain as it landed on the tin roof. Suddenly, there was a brutal knocking on the side of the van, as if some rabid bear was trying to pry its way inside. Gasping for breath, I reached for a light. I switched on the door open lights in an attempt to scare off whatever animal was outside. Illuminated through the dingy windows was a silhouette so unlike a bear's I nearly pissed myself in shock. I noticed that the thing had stopped banging at the door and was instead standing statue still, leering at me. I shoved myself backwards into the opposing wall, praying that it didn't know that glass was easier to break than metal, and cried out. I grabbed for an old softball bat I hoped I had been too lazy to toss out. And just like that, it was gone. I was heaving an attempt to calm myself down when I realized that Warren was nowhere to be found. He wasn't in a spot on the cot where we'd fallen asleep. The daze of sleep was completely drawn from me as I realized the Warren was outside with that ravenous wild animal. I only then conveniently remembered that shitty pocket knife on my keyring and burst from the back of the van to find him. I shone my flashlight all around me as if it would protect me like salt.
Warren! Warren, where are you?
I was begging him to answer. I couldn't bear the thought that he'd gone out for a piss and been snatched by something while I slept.
War?
I whirled around suddenly at the sound of the car door opening. I watched in disbelief as he stepped out of the passenger side door, looking at me with concern. I fell back a step before running into him, scalding him the entire time.
I thought you died, you piece of shit.
I yelled.
What the fuck?
As the moonlights reflect across 1,000 droplets of water scattered across the van, he explained that he found the seats more comfortable than the back of the car. I started laughing at my own absurdity, thinking he'd gotten killed before I remembered the shadow outside the van. I tried to tell him what happened, but he stared back at me skeptically.
You're telling me that on your trip to get inspiration for your next horror novel, you were attacked by a ghoul in the forest?
He asked reasonably.
You had a bad dream, Bo. Working yourself up again.
I sighed in response. He's compelling.
Yeah.
He shook his head and chuckled.
Go back to bed. We'll push back our alarm a few hours so you can sleep this off.
The next morning, I woke with a gasp, remembering the night prior. I flipped over and saw Warren passed out beside me. Authors shouldn't keep themselves up at night with their own stories. The effects of listening to horror podcasts all night were catching up to me. After heating up some soggy hot dogs and kicking Warren awake, we set out on the road again. Nice thing about not having a destination is that you're never behind schedule. We were now veering right on our path and quickly approaching the West Virginia border.
Wanna go to Harper's Ferry?
I asked it excitedly. My AP US history class filtered my mind at the name. I expected clinical sarcasm return, but I hadn't accounted for Warren's inclination for flora. He responded quickly.
Looking for directions.
We should camp proper, pull out the tent, and build a fire.
I offered, knowing that it'd be a welcome change from the van life.
Just promise not to shit yourself again.
He shot at me. I rolled my eyes at him, realizing I will never live down my episode from last night. I wish I had more interesting notes to report during the climatic break in this story, but you can only say so much about the freeway and 10 questions to ask on long car rides. We finally managed to find the official campgrounds for the park and pulled in. We slid the tent and the night's gear out from the back of the trunk, strapping the worst of it to our backs. I staked a map from a post nearby as we walked into the underbrush. It was surprisingly cool despite the June weather, and I was grateful for the shade. I led the way through the winding paths, referring to the map to any array of multicolored trail markers. It was so surreal being surrounded by wildlife older than 3 generations of my ancestors. I'd always dreamed of seeing the Appalachian Trail, drawn in by its folklore and grandiosity. And this was it, a lifelong dream spread out thousands of acres around me.
Here's the designated camping area.
I called behind me. Warren was a few feet behind me, picking up some variety of dogwood leaves. Only a few yards ahead, I threw down the tarp and spokes for tonight's tent. I started to assemble the tent as the sun began to set. In the meantime, I called out to Warren.
Hey, go get some firewood. I want to get that ramen boiling.
In response, I received an ominous salute and the image of his back wandering into the bush. After we returned, we arranged the wood into a pyre and set our pot of wood on top, ready to boil. We sat back against our packs and stared up at the sky.
Warren,
He hummed in reply.
what are you going to do when we get back?
I looked up at him, wondering.
What do you mean?
He seemed put out, but I wasn't sure why.
You just never...
I was cut off by Warren jumping up abruptly, patting down his pants like they were on fire.
Shit. I think I dropped my phone when I was getting wood.
He seemed panicked. Just then, a few drops of water began to fall from the sky. Just as I had the thought, Warren stole it from my lips.
It's not supposed to rain tonight.
I looked back at him baffled.
It's not a big deal, War. We have a tent for a reason.
The look he gave me wasn't one I'd seen before.
I need to find my phone before it gets soaked.
And with that, he sprinted off into the dark. I got up to follow him, but I wasn't stupid enough to get myself turned around in pitch black forest chasing someone I couldn't see. I checked my watch and decided that if he didn't find his way back within 90 minutes, I would call Park Services to help me find him. In the meantime, I gave up on my ramen and retreated to the tent to escape the thick mountain rain. I sat through exactly 93 minutes of torture waiting for him to come back. And the worst part, the first sign of him was screaming. The most blood-curdling cries I have ever heard. I shot out of the tent, wielding the biggest flashlight we brought on the trip and my dinky keyring knife. I could imagine what he had gotten himself into at this hour. He screamed again, and I ran towards the sound, disregarding any movie warning. I finally understood what pushed those death-bound characters into danger.
Warren, where the fuck are you?
I yelled into the void. I continued running through the brambles, catching my sweatshirt on crooked branches until I bursted through the tree line and into a clearing. I tripped on the coarse turf of the wood's edge and the palm of the ground in front of me. I was soaked to the bone. The thick wild grass had absorbed the torrent from the heavens, transferring it to my sleeves and socks. I could hardly see at this point, blinded by deadly night and rivers of water sloughing off my face. There was a third cry, this time directly in front of me. I pulled myself to my feet, shining my flashlight at the ground defensively. My heart dropped at the sight laid out before me. Warren covered in blood and thick Virginia mud. I struggled to focus on him, with the rain pooling in my eyes. I dropped to my knees in an attempt to assess the damage, but my nerves were fried. I shook his shoulder and tried to get his attention. He looked up wearily before his eyes suddenly shot open, and he tried to push himself off of me.
Hey, it's me. You're okay. It's okay.
I tried to calm him down before he tore himself further on the briars, but he wouldn't still himself. He used a nearby downed tree to lift himself back onto his feet. I couldn't comprehend his inability to let me help him. I took a step towards him. He must have been in some kind of panic-induced shock. I watched in horror as he doubled over, stumbling backwards into the bush.
Bo,
He rasped.
I need you to get back to the tent.
He said it so matter-of-factly, like it was a simple instruction intended to make my night more convenient. I expected him to pass out momentarily from blood loss, but instead I stood, shocked still as something came over him. He fell to his palms, mirroring my previous slip, and convulsed brutally. I was torn between actions. I didn't have any cell service, and my first aid supplies were at camp. And I was certain I wouldn't be able to find the clearing again in the thick night. I watched his arms elongated into spindly spider-like limbs and his spine curved in a way that was more that of a hyena than a human. I watched until my best man was lying in a pile of his own flesh and blood, ripping into his own skin as if trying to cause a hemorrhage. I fell backwards in disgust before him, and he looked up at me for the first time, snapped from his inner struggle. I thought I saw some sort of apology in his marred grimace before I screamed bloody murder and turned away. Any sense of familiarity was snuffed as he approached me, looming over me with ripped clothes and ghoulish skin slickened with rainwater. He snarled at me, raring to sever my throat, but I rolled to my right instinctively. I shoved myself up to my knees and booked it towards the van, cutting past the tent. I used my flashlight to guide me, but it did little more than give me the vague pretense of an advantage. With every step I took, I could feel the space between us shrinking at a rate unsustainable to my escape. I could feel the wind behind me and my smoke-shrunken lungs struggling to carry me. I whipped out my pocket knife and turned around, wedging it into his chest in a feral attempt to flee. I heard a shriek behind me, but continued towards the tree line and four-wheeled safety. I saw the van in the distance and fumbled with a key fob in my pocket, unlocking the doors as I approached. I swung the door open and threw myself inside, crushing the lock button as soon as I could. I watched as Warren stalked dirt from the trees in front of me and stood right in front of the dingy hood. I had turned on my high beams and regretfully reversed out of the parking lot as fast as possible, but was met by resistance as I realized that the storm had formed what was effectively a moat barring me from my freedom. Desperate to preserve my only way out of these woods, I put the car into park and prepared myself for the night's exaggerated horrors. I sat resigned in the driver's seat as he approached me, ragged and angry, the headlights illuminating large gashes across his abdomen and his grotesque frame. I flicked through my scary story catalog and thought of hundreds of humanoid encounters, which was entirely useless. He walked up to the opposite window and started banging on the glass harder and harder until the van shook with fury. I saw my shank protruding from his chest, still there from my prior assault. I cried into my knees, hopeless. The glass began to splinter and give, and I could feel shards of the splintering pieces, the soft skin of my cheek, as the water streaming down the windows began pooling in its sills. I had the juvenile thought that maybe I could reach some part of him deep down that would fight his nocturnal urges. But this wasn't a Grimm's fairy tale. There was no rephrasing of "this isn't you" that could save me now. If I hadn't sacrificed my only weapon for a speedy getaway, I still don't think I could have held the nerve to wield it against his fully illuminated form. Call it luck, but I saw the first few wisps of summer sunlight peeking through the forested ceiling. Having the realization simultaneously, Warren abandoned his pursuit of my blood in exchange for a dash towards the greater forest. In a wave of relief and 24 hours without sleep, I lost consciousness against the steering wheel. I awoke for the second morning in a row with a major headache and the faint idea that I should be having a panic attack. I sat up, triggered the horn, and opened the door to my left. I practically fell out of the car in an attempt to reorientate myself. Despite the notion of common sense, I grabbed the most menacing stick in my peripheral and headed out towards the tent. Along the trail, I remembered all the places where Warren had stopped to examine a species or sketched a leaf-eating beetle in his field journal. I started to jog as I tried to make it back as quickly as possible. As the blue tarp came into view, so did a silhouette against the thin material. I ran towards Warren, seeing that there was a large gash in the side of his face and a worrying lack of cloth on his body. Checking for breath, I found my emergency kit and mentally prepared myself to give someone stitches. When I turned back towards him, he was slightly conscious and looked at me with a frightened worry. He grabbed my wrist, and I had to focus really hard not to flinch away, remembering the night prior. Before I could reassure him of my sewing ability, he whispered 2 words.
I'm sorry.
Apologize to me after you're not about to die.
That annoying priest is pounding on my door again, insisting I allow him to exorcise the demon from my husband's body. What, does he think I went to all that trouble of summoning him for nothing? I got trapped at the top of a Ferris wheel with an unwanted passenger by Sugar Sod. I was beyond irritated as I walked behind my 2 best friends, Emily and Chloe. They had invited me to the fairgrounds with them, and then spent the entire time giggling to themselves and excluding me. Thankfully, the fairgrounds was closing up so I could go home and wallow in my own misery. I was about to sneak off towards my car, leaving them to walk home, when they let out exciting shrieks of joy in front of me. I was then unceremoniously dragged towards a Ferris wheel. They both hopped on together, and I had no choice but to sit on an empty seat by myself. We were the only people on the ride, and the employee was barely paying any attention to us. They were bouncing with joy as they rose into the air, pointing out all the stuff we could see in the distance. I was staring off into nothingness when I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I turned around and instantly regretted it, as my face now inches away from what only could be described as a burn victim. His flesh looked charred, and the right side of his skull was so burnt that you could see parts of his skull peeking through. His eye sockets were hollow, and a steady stream of maggots poured out and landed on the seat beside us. I wanted to scream, but my breath caught on my throat, and I just sat there shaking, staring into his face. The Ferris wheel grounded to a halt, and I could see out of the corner of my eye my 2 friends getting off and running off hand in hand. Obliviously, they and the operator forgot about it, as the lights on the machine were switched off, leaving me suspended at the very top. A chuckle that sounded like sandpaper emerged from the burning man, as he knew I was trapped up here with him. The lights in the fairground went off one by one as my feeble cries for help went unnoticed, until the only light came from the full moon overhead. His face slowly moved closer until it was less than an inch from my own. I could feel heat emitting from his flesh, and became convinced that I would have a tan if I survived this. His hands crept up and gripped mine, and I let out a whimper as some of his skin fell off, and I was now clutching bony fingers. He began moving our hands around in what could only be described as a waltz, as I prayed that my friends would soon notice I was missing and come looking for me. A tongue emerged from his mouth, and I winced as it began caressing my cheek. It forced its way into my mouth, and revulsion overwhelmed me as it tasted like charcoal. My eyes widened in fear as I noticed that his tongue was no longer attached to his mouth, and was actually moving of its own accord. It pushed further into my mouth and seemed to be trying to climb down my throat. I snatched my hands free and gripped the end of the tongue and desperately tried to pull it out. It ensnared my own tongue as tears were flowing down my cheek, as every attempt to pull it out caused me anguishing pain. Eventually, its grip on my own tongue loosened, and I managed to pull it free and threw it to the ground beside me. I was wrenching from the putrid taste, while I could hear it slithering around beneath me. It wrapped itself around my foot and began crawling up my leg. Anger overwhelmed me as I used my other foot to begin stamping on it. Within a minute, it was just a bloody mess beside us. Throughout this whole time, the burn man sat beside me, rocking in merriment at my predicament. He then rested his head on my shoulder as I sat there too petrified to move. I must have drifted off to sleep, as the next thing I remember is the sounds of voices beneath me and the Ferris wheel suddenly jolting into life. I ignored the shock reaction on the Ferris wheel operator as I jumped off as soon as my seat reached ground level and dashed towards my car at full sprint. I now stand at home staring into a mirror at my once golden hair, which is now as white as a sheet, and telling myself to get some new friends, while trying to convince myself that whatever was crawling up my leg was simply a wasp. The jungle went silent the moment we found Ferris, his rifle snapped in half beside him in the mud. Above his twitching body stood a praying mantis the size of an elephant, calmly turning his severed head between its mandibles like it was cracking an open fruit. And with that, our time together is coming to an end. If you have a story you'd like me to narrate, whether true or fictional, you can send it my way 3 different ways. All the links, including the ones to my socials, are down below for you guys. I'd like to thank both the writers who let me read their stories this evening. I was also joined by 2 awesome voices as well. Boo was played by The Keeper, and Warren played by Angelo the Poet. Please remember to check them out, and tell them 242 sent you when you do. I really enjoyed that first story. 2 guys just trying to figure out exactly what they want in life and, have experiences to draw on, especially if you're trying to be a horror writer. My only question is, if Warren knew he changed when it rained, why did he agree to go on this trip? Did he actually want someone else to figure it out, or were they just so stir-crazy that they were willing to take any risk just to leave the town they grew up in? Then to be stuck on a Ferris wheel, no one notices, not even your friends that you're with, and then for something to be stuck up there with you, just ugh. Some of that made me gag after I narrated it. If you have friends that don't even notice when you disappear, I'm sorry, but you don't really have friends, you have acquaintances that you hang out with. Sadly, I actually know this from experience. It's best to go find friends who actually care about you. And if you enjoy these stories, please hit that like button and make sure it feels it. If you're new, please subscribe and turn that pretty little bell to all notifications. And if you're able to, please hype this video so we can get out to new people who might also enjoy it. And I would absolutely love a comment. Tell me what you think, what kind of stories you like in the future. And if you can add, next time I'm getting a hotel room, so I know you got this far. If you're listening on the podcast and are able to, please leave a review and a comment. If you're willing to help this channel and podcast grow, please share with anyone who might enjoy it. It always helps quite a bit. But if you're willing to help in a more financial way, like these lovely people on screen right now, I do have Patreon and memberships where you get early access and a few other bonuses as well. But if you want to do more of a one-time thing, I do have PayPal, Buy Me a Coffee, and Super Thanks. But as always, thank you for just watching and listening. It always has and always will mean the world to me. Sleep tight and don't let 42 bite.